Okay. All right, we're going to wrap up chapter 9 today. I was told that if we didn't get through chapter 9 today, I have to bring Starbucks for the congregation next week, and that's not going to happen. So we are pretty much done with 9. All we're going to do is talk about the other 2. There were 3 views on the prophecy. We kind of started last week where we talked about the non-millennial view. We're just going to look at the other 2 real quick. We're pretty much done with 9. I'd like to, if we have time, just go ahead and start getting into 10. 10's a little easier. We'll talk about that when we get to it. And it actually coincides a lot with what we're doing in Revelation. So that's good. But anyway, back to chapter 9. We're just finishing up the views. We're done with the actual text of the chapter. So, as always, it's open to comments and commentary, and it's perfectly okay to get sidetracked and go down a rabbit hole somewhere. That's usually what we do anyway.
We're looking for coffee, so
yeah, we're just waiting for coffee because the coffee wasn't starting on time. But that's all right.
It's fine. The Lord will handle it.
It's okay, Tyler.
We'll see if I make it home in one piece.
Do you mind moving to the end?
Yeah,
so that
yeah,
the
absolutely.
screen can kind of see.
And I could move the podium too. Tell you what, let me just slide the podium over a little bit because I'm going to need my notes, and we'll just slide it back for worship. It's not a big deal. So hopefully everybody can see the board. And it's not you can find these diagrams online if you just get on Google or whatever. These are just general diagrams trying to cover the views of this prophecy. And again, I know we've talked about Daniel 9. It's kind of like inside baseball stuff. It's, when you start throwing around numbers and stats, people's eyes just kind of glaze over, like, I don't even know where we're at. And it's okay. It's a difficult section. It's probably the most controversial and most difficult to understand section of Daniel from a lot of biblical scholars' perspective. It's okay. We just need to cover it. We'll get through it. And, we'll go through the various views. We talked about the non-millennial view last week. We're talking about the premillennial view this week. Basically, the outline is roughly the same for all 3 views because we're talking about the prophetic 70 weeks. The premillennial view here states that the decree to rebuild the city, Jerusalem, begins with Nehemiah, the prophet Nehemiah, in 445 BC. This view also holds that each week, again, is broken into 7 years. As the first view was also, each week is broken into 7 years. Therefore, the 69 weeks equals 483 years. Rachel pointed that out last week. Adding 483 years to 445 BC, the decree to Nehemiah, at least according to this view, gives us a date of about 38 AD, which would have to be the time of the coming of the Messiah. There's only one problem with 38 AD. You guys know what it is, right? That can't be the coming of the Messiah. Why?
it's fast.
He was also already came, lived, crucified, resurrected, ascended to heaven. Yeah. So the date is off with this view. It's off by about 7 years. That's a problem. Although, let's be honest, none of these views may be exactly perfect. Everyone kind of has their own opinion on this. It's okay. It's kind of like Revelation. In fact, it's a lot like Revelation. A lot of the stuff in Daniel, next week's going to tie, chapter 10, if you start on today, you're going to see it ties right into Revelation, some of the chapters that we've talked about already. Let's see, has more than 7 years, too much time on it, we just talked about it. This view also has the Messiah being cut off during the 69 weeks instead of after them, as verse 26 in chapter 9 clearly states. So this view has another problem with the timeline. This view goes on to state that the 70 week has not yet occurred and that the prophetic clock stopped at the death of Jesus Christ. So here's what we have in this timeline. The decree to Nehemiah in 445 BC goes all the way down to the cross. And then there's this gap in the premillennial view. You have this big dip, or like this area that doesn't even exist In the premillennial view, that's what they consider the church age. You have, in the prophecy, you have 70 weeks foretold. In the premillennial view, you get to like the 69th week, and then the 70th week just doesn't exist for 2,000 years. It's just not there. They say, well, Jesus died on the cross, and then you have the church age. I'll just kind of read some notes here. It might make a little bit more sense to you. This view goes on to state that the 70th week has not yet occurred. Instead, the prophetical clock stopped at the death of Jesus Christ on the cross and has not started again. Therefore, the church age has a 2,000-year gap and counting. I mean, we're still in the church age according to well, we are, but according to this view, 2,000-year gap so far, just that we have so far. I mean, if Jesus doesn't come back in another 1,000 years, then we have a 3,000-year gap. 2,000-year gap and counting into 70 weeks. In the 70th week, the view states that it will begin with the rapture of the church, and that the 7 years will constitute the tribulation period. So this is the final week, the 1 week period, and all the views is the 70th week. In the premillennial view, you've got this 2,000 years church period, and then the 70th week occurs, and that's the tribulation, the second coming. It's actually divided in half with a lot of premillennial views. And the last week, what you have is the tribulation for like 3.5 weeks, and then the second half of the week is considered the Great Tribulation. It also states that the one that causes the sacrifice to cease in the prophecy is the Antichrist. That's the premillennial view. We talked about in the non-millennial view initially, the person mentioned that causes the sacrifice to cease. A popular view there is that it's the Emperor Vespasian of Rome. The premillennial view, it is the Antichrist. There's some problems with the premillennial view. We'll just kind of go through them. This view also treats each week as 7 years. However, as noted before, we talked about last week, there's no indication that during this 70-week prophecy that each period of time is 7 years. There's no indication. We just use it as humans to make the numbers fit. And even in this prophecy, we see the numbers don't exactly fit. Because, again, like in 38 AD, Christ has already been, he's been alive, he's had his ministry, he's died on the cross, and been resurrected, so the numbers just don't add up correctly. The view says that the decree begins with Nehemiah in 445 BC, but why did they use this date? The temple, we know, was finished in 516 BC. This decree to Nehemiah was not to rebuild the temple, but was to rebuild the city, and only the city walls. Further, as already noted, the chronology shoots us far past the life of Christ, which ends, in this view, it ends in 38 AD. Isaiah prophesied that it would be Cyrus who would decree the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the temple. Can someone turn over to Isaiah 44? I think we may have mentioned this last week. And someone can turn over to Isaiah 45:13, and we'll just read both these texts. 44, verses 26 through 28, if somebody can read that.
what?
44, 26 through 28, sorry.
Confirming the word of his servant and performing the purpose of his messengers. It is I who say of Jerusalem, she shall be inhabited, and all of the cities of Judah they shall be built, and I will raise up her ruins again. It is I who says to the depth of the sea, be dried up, and I will make your rivers dry. It is I who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he will perform all my desire, and he declares of Jerusalem, she will be built, and of the temple, your foundation will be laid.
Okay. So we have the prophecy there, or the statement about the rebuilding. 45:13, does someone have that? Isaiah 45:13.
I have raised him up in righteousness, and I will direct all his ways. He shall build my city, and let my exiles go free. Not for price nor reward, says the Lord of hosts.
Okay. So we have clear references within the Bible of the decree, when it was issued and who it was issued by. So that's a problem with this view as well. Again, this view goes back to the decree was issued to Nehemiah by, I believe, Artaxerxes, the king of Medo-Persian Empire at the time. It doesn't seem to match up, and we have clear definitive proof here in the Bible that it was actually Cyrus that issued the decree. So the numbers and the people don't even seem to match up correctly. But that's the view that a lot of people take, and they're convinced that this is when the decree occurred. This is correct. Doesn't seem to match up. Third point, Gabriel says that after 62 weeks plus 7 weeks, so that'd be 69, the Messiah is cut off. That's in verse 26 of chapter 9. Thus the 70th week has not yet happened. Therefore the consequences that the Messiah has not been cut off yet. We know this is not true because we know that the Messiah was cut off in death on the cross. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. From the decree to rebuild to the completion of the rebuilding in the prophecy is 7 weeks. That would be 49 years, because remember, each week is 7 years, according to the interpretation of the prophecy. So this would be 49 years. Add 49 years to 445 BC. This leaves us with a date of 396 BC for the completion of the walls. However, we know, according to the scriptures, that the city was completed by Nehemiah in 444 BC. This view violates the known history of the completion of Jerusalem. We have the known date of the completion of the city of Jerusalem, the walls of the city proper. So this view actually violates that. We know the date because history has told us the date. We can prove the date. So again, another problem with this view. The view of the gap of the 2,000 years or more is inserted in the message of the 70 weeks. The problem with this gap, the premillennial gap, is that it's inconsistent with the view. If each week equals 7 years, and then those years are counted from 445 BC, how can we stop the chronology? The major problem I have with this view is that they get to a certain point of the prophecy and they're like, okay, we got to make this fit. We'll just kind of forget about the last week and we'll call that the church age. And then we'll make the last week the second coming. That'll be the 7-year period, the tribulation and the great tribulation. That's fine and good. Maybe it fits to a degree, but that's not what the prophecy tells us. And Daniel 9, it's inconsistent with the prophecy. Gabriel never says that in the vision. Did Gabriel not know that these things were going to take place? Doesn't make sense. The view adds time to the scripture. It adds time to the prophecy in Daniel 9 that is not there in Daniel 9. So another problem with the premillennial view. Therefore, we reject the view largely, although that is the most common view of this prophecy. The premillennial view is the most common religious view. Again, is this life or death stuff? Is this an issue of salvation? Not necessarily. A lot of Christians talk about the 70th week and the time of tribulation and trial. That is a big issue. We're not here to condemn anyone for their opinion on the prophecy. It's not a life or death issue. If your opinion on the prophecy is the premillennial opinion from what you read in the Bible, that's fine. We're just looking at the various views and looking at the pros and cons for each view. We're going to wrap it up here in a minute and get on to chapter 10. The last few, go ahead.
What's the importance from the premillennial view on the tribulation? Why is that such an important 7 years for to believe that?
Well, obviously, because of the second coming, But a lot of, and I think it falls back in with Revelation, like we were talking about how the two books match up. The popular view with Revelation as well, with the trial and tribulation and the things that will happen at the end of time. There are some views with prophecy, and we're going to get to the symbolic view, where at the end of the symbolic view, you can see it talks about the destruction of Jerusalem and the destruction of Rome. Is that interpretation? But yeah, the 7-year period, the final tribulation, the final.
Isn't that where they believe that there's going to be basically a reign on earth, and that there's going to be a bunch of people that are going to be able to have the opportunities? Like, there will be those that are saved that are going to be living, and they're going to be tried and going through trials.
Yeah, based on what I understand.
Yeah, so I think that's one of the issues, the other issues, when you start talking about translations, that's really, really dangerous, right? Because what happens is you set up an expectation that we can't prove is either correct or incorrect, right? And then people start to build their belief system around this thing that we don't know for sure is going to happen.
Yeah, that's a big problem in the religious world today, especially in America, is setting up expectations or basing your Christianity and justifying things on aspects that you can neither prove or disprove.
Yeah.
I just coincidentally, I've been watching a lot of videos lately on like the mega church preachers and things like that. These guys like Joel Osteen or Kenneth Copeland, they're like on the 3rd private jet, living in $1 million homes. And if you confront them and you're like, well, this is not what the Bible teaches. Why do you live like this? And they'll respond with something like, well, you don't know my heart. You can't tell me. You can't judge me. You can't tell. I mean, how do you prove or dis? It gets gray. It gets murky, and that's why they're never really convicted of things that they're doing. It seems like the same thing with doctrine. If you're a Christian and you're here today and your doctrine is not based off the New Testament, the Gospels, and your doctrine is based off of prophetic views, then you're kind of going about it all backwards. You're basing your doctrine on something you can neither prove nor disprove.
Right.
I mean, a lot of people believe it with all their heart, though, various prophetic views, and you can't tell them anything. They'll go to symbolic books like Revelation to try to justify it. Instead of when you confront someone or you speak to someone, instead of going to like Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, Romans, or whatever, they'll go to prophetic language and literature.
If I could add on, it's interesting, when you start your walk, or if you're in your walk and you start reading fiction, right? The Left Behind series really focuses on tribulation.
Yeah.
And so we have a lot of folks that, who do understand the Bible and then understand that this is just the interpretation of what it could be versus those that will accept what the Left Behind series says.
And I think that the scary thing is, so often when we set up these belief systems around these theories, right? When someone can poke a hole in it, right? Then the person who believes it gets disheartened. And that is why I get scared, because there's like, I'm not bought off on the premillennial view, but if somebody is reading the Bible on a daily basis and they're kind of in this premillennial opinion, then should we kick them while they're studying? Right? I don't think so. But also, the more they study, they have to be willing to be open-minded to the fact that there is nothing that I think defines. There's just too many holes within it to base your complete foundation off of something like that.
Yeah. Again, it goes back to your doctrine and your belief system. What are you basing it off of? Are you basing it off prophecy, or are you basing it off, the things that you read in the New Testament, the Gospels, and things your concrete doctrine? We sing the song, my hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' love and righteousness. And I mean, my hope's not built off the prophecy in Daniel 9.
Right.
It's just not. I mean, and again, not to, like you said, we'll never kick anybody when they're down and they're studying and stuff. You may have a nominal view a more cataclysmic end of time view, the premillennial view, or you may have just a more symbolic view, and that's fine. This is not. It shouldn't be life or death. It shouldn't be issues of salvation stuff. If it is an issue of salvation to you, then we need to talk, because you're kind of looking at the wrong stuff in the Bible. But yeah, and the interesting thing I mentioned a minute ago too, talking about the premillennial view. And there's nothing necessarily inherently wrong with this, but they do consider the last week, the 70th week, to be broken in half. We have the first 3.5 years as the tribulation, and the final 3.5 years as great tribulation. You would know more about that because of some of the books you've read, like Left Behind. I'm not real well versed in that. I don't know what that's all about. I just know there's a difference between the two. But
how about a general question to everybody? Are the numbers, the weeks themselves, from our standpoint, from our individual standpoints, are they important?
Well, I think they're important, but in context. You know, I mean, what are the numbers really saying to us? And we're going to get into the symbolic view here in a minute. But I mean, are the numbers literal? They can't be. They can't be literal, because Gabriel gave Daniel this prophecy in Daniel 9, and he says 70 weeks. Well, we know in Daniel 9 that Daniel is praying because of the 70 years of captivity that was prophesied and that was literal. And Gabriel the angel tells him there's going to be 70 more weeks. Well, it can't be 70 weeks. It doesn't match up with anything. So it has to be figurative. It has to be symbolic. But what does that mean exactly?
So that's exactly where I was headed. So if it is symbolic, then what is it that we're supposed to get out of it?
Yeah, what's the message you're supposed to get?
And that's the thing that sometimes we struggle, right? When we look at these different views, we try to define things that aren't intended to necessarily be defined, right? The point is what is the message of the image, right? So often we're like, well, what does 62 weeks mean? Is that 7 years per week? But the point is, there's going to be a time frame between when the temple is built and the temple destruction, and there's going to be some stuff that happens, and then at the end, Jesus is going to get crucified, and he's going to destroy the temple, and boom, there's going to be a new age. That's the point.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the symbolic view, it's a little...
Write that down.
You're going to be quizzed on that.
I'm just trying to figure this out, you know?
It's tough.
Because there's 3 timelines, and in my Bible, because I have like a 50-50, it's like a regular Bible. It sounds weird. Anyways, I got a regular Bible, and the bottom half is like the study version. And I have like 4 different timelines with different words and reviews. Maccabee, dispensational.
Yeah. What are the 4 views you have?
Covenantal? I don't know.
Yeah.
But like, I'm trying to figure that out and then match this up with this. So.
Yeah.
And then like you were saying, Chris, about trying to figure out like if this, what were you saying, like not a figure speech, what were you saying about the interpretation of the timelines?
It's the point of the prophecy, not the literal translation of it, right?
Yeah, because that kind of, this whole thing kind of comes back. It's just me and my older grandparents put it out, and we would always just debate about creationism, like how the earth was created. Nobody was around. Literally nobody.
Yep.
And it doesn't say in the Bible how it was made. He just said he made it.
Yep.
So it could have been all these science theories, which I know is pretty contradictory, but that's just one of the. This is kind of going back with the creation. It's kind of going with the Daniel 9 this whole timeline. It's like, it could have been 70 weeks, or it could have been 70 weeks and a little bit here and there extra that we just don't know about.
I agree with 99% of what you said. Yes. The point of it is there was a time frame that went up until Jerusalem was restored, and there's a timeline between when the Messiah is going to come, and there's a timeline between that and the resurrection, and then there's going to be destruction of the temple, and there's going to be destruction of Jerusalem. Right? What's the need? This is the struggle I've always had.
Yeah.
What is the need to figure out what exactly the weeks outside of the grand point, right? It's just something to create, and this is going back to my point earlier. It creates this splitting of hairs within the church that then causes us to have division. That it's not necessary. There's no reason for one of us to be like, I'm not millennial, well, I'm symbolic, and boom, I'm going to a different church. I don't know.
We start dividing into our little factions. There's no reason for any of that. You know, it's just utterly ridiculous.
Well, I mean, like, kind of piggyback off of that, Chris, is like for somebody that may not be well versed in this whole Daniel 9 and the timeline thing, like holding to the side and kind of one-on-one counseling and kind of with them, be like, okay, why do you think this is this? And then you may be able to have more wisdom on the fact and kind of share with them that, hey, this is actually what it's supposed to mean, and then kind of spin them up. That's kind of what I'm dealing with right now. I need someone to kind of spin me up to date with, like, which of these views is.
Well, let me ask you a question. If you had a bunch of guys that were mature in the church, right?
Yeah.
Guys have been going to church for a long, long time, and they had this argument within the church about whether or not I'm premillennial or I'm symbolic. What would that do for someone who's a new Christian?
It would, if it were me, it would be like a sense of distrust. It's like, what do I trust is the correct information?
There you go.
Because, like, at that point, a brand new person that's never been to church in a day in their life may think the Bible is just
confusing,
like a fiction, sci-fi novel or something.
And I know, and Rachel has a question, I think, but I'll just say this, and I'm glad that for right now, for Bible study, that we don't have visitors here, because I don't want to cover this. For visitors here, it's just ridiculous. It's not the time or the place for people that just walked in.
Yeah.
You know, so.
Well, my stance is I don't have a view on any of them.
Yeah, that's fine.
I don't care. Why do I care?
Yeah. Well,
Why
in the
should
context
I care?
here.
Why should I care?
You shouldn't care on the fact that it was promised and it was stated and it was predicted.
That it's
You
perfect.
should absolutely care
I
about
don't care if it's non-millennial
No, yeah.
Right.
millennial or symbolic.
Yeah. There's no reason to get hung up on that. Now, let me just say
I don't
this.
want to be put into a category.
Yeah.
Oh, you're
Categorized and classified.
Oh, you're
Yeah.
non-millennial.
We tend to do that today with everything, don't we? We have to put you in a category or a class of. Let me just say this before we get into the final view, and we'll wrap it up and start with 10. But in the context of 9, it's I think it kind of points more to the symbolic view, because in the context of 9, again, Gabriel comes to Daniel. Daniel's praying because they're almost out of the 70 years of bondage to the Babylonians. And then Gabriel comes to him and says, okay, there's going to be 70 more something, 70 more weeks, 70 more months, 70 more something that your people are going to have to go through. Well, and I'm jumping ahead, but according to the timeline and the symbolic view, that fits better because you're talking about your people are going to endure, you're going to have to go through this restoration of the city, coming into the Messiah, the death of the Messiah, destruction of the temple, destruction of Jerusalem, and then it's going to prophesy the destruction of Rome. So that would affect them. You know, not Daniel personally, but his descendants. So, you know, it is what it is. We'll talk about it real quick, wrap it up, and if anybody has comments, that's fine. The only view that seems to make a little more sense is a symbolic view. This ties into Revelation. We've been talking a lot about this in Revelation. When we look at the 7 weeks, we can interpret this similar to how we interpret some of the stuff in Revelations. In Revelations, you know, we've been talking about like perfect numbers, tens, and then other numbers that can mean a long period of time, it can mean a short period of time. You know, the 144 that it mentions in Revelations, is that a literal number? Is that a figurative number to illustrate a multitude? When you look at the 7 weeks, during the symbolic view, it's more of an interpretation of a short period of time. While the 62 weeks in the symbolic view is an interpretation of a longer period of time. When Daniel prays about the prophesied 70 years of captivity, Gabriel has given him another 70, indicating that the people will have to endure another period. The exact time is not given. It's not given in the prophecy. The issue of the decree, someone turn over to 2 Chronicles 36. Should I just turn over there a minute ago? 2 Chronicles 36.
What verse?
23 and 24.
Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to the building a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever there is among you of all his people, may the Lord his God be with him, and let him go up.
What's Cyrus saying there? It's pretty obvious. The Lord has spoken to me, he's talked to me, he's appointed to me to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. All of you Israelites that are able and capable, I want you to go, I want you to do it. So again, going back to what we talked about earlier, we know that Cyrus issued the decree because it's right there in Chronicles. It's also in the book of Ezra. We won't flip over to it, but unless, if you want to study it, it's in Ezra, verses 1 through 3, the same decree. So we have a definitive answer on who issued the decree and when and to who. So we know that the temple was completed in 516 and the city was completed in 444 BC. These are dates that we know. We know that's from history. They shouldn't be up for debate. But these completion dates are less than 100 years from the time of the decree. That would seem logical that the 7 weeks mentioned in the prophecy in Daniel 9 simply refers to a short period of time. That's the symbolic view. Do you have another opinion? That's okay. From the completion of the temple and the city to the coming of the Messiah would be 62 weeks, which would seem to indicate that it's a longer period of time. It's a general number, 62, just indicating a longer period of time. We mentioned this before, and it's okay if you don't know the answer. I just want to kind of see who might have caught it. But from the completion of the temple and the walls to the coming of the Messiah, do you know how many years that was? Do you guys remember? It's okay if you know. I was hoping somebody might catch it. Over 400. It's a considerably longer period of time. Over 400 years. Verse 26 tells us that after the 62 weeks, in the 70th week, the Messiah will be cut off. This is a clear reference to the crucifixion of Jesus. It's also referenced in Isaiah 53. I'm going to go over that today in service for the Lord's table. Chapter 53 of Isaiah is a clear reference, prophecy. It's a biography of Jesus Christ. It's actually like a chapter degree if you're ever interested. Some biblical scholars consider Isaiah 53 the most important chapter of the Old Testament. So again, verse 26 then tells us that the people. Here's where we were talking about this last week, and Rachel mentioned it too. And here's where it gets a little dicey, because it would indicate that in verse 26 of chapter 9 of Daniel in the prophecy, that it's talking about two different events, two different people in the same verse. And I think that kind of throws people off. In verse 26 it tells us, the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. We know that through history that the city and the sanctuary were destroyed when? When was Jerusalem destroyed? We've talked about this before. It was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. This is less than 40 years after Jesus was crucified. The events are said to happen in the last week, which is that 1 week period of time, the 70th week. That's the really short period at the end of the prophecy that all three views take into account, the lone 70th week. In the symbolic view, the 1 week just seems to represent a short period of time, the 40 years or so from the death of Christ to the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. Verse 27 tells us, and he will make a firm covenant with many for 1 week. I'm sorry, I think I misspoke when I said verse 26 a minute ago. But in the middle of the 1 week, he will put a stop to the sacrifice and the grain offering. In verse 27 of Daniel 9, in the prophecy, who is he? Who is he that will make a firm covenant with many, and in the middle of the week will put a stop to the sacrifice sacrifice and grain offering. Who is he? Who is this prophecy about? Jesus. Jesus, yeah. And we'll talk about it in a minute where it kind of confuses people because I think it's just a lack of not catching the words in the verses. But verse 27 in the symbolic view. He will make a firm covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he will put a stop to the sacrifice and the grain offering. The he here seems to clearly indicate it's a reference to Jesus. It's a reference to the Messiah.
Who else could it be? Who else
Couldn't
do people
be.
think they are?
Yeah,
Who else do somebody might think it was?
yeah. I think it's a little later than we'll get to here in a second, where they start getting a little confused. But any thoughts on that verse though? When it talks about in the middle of the week, things will kind of change a little bit in the middle of the week. You remember we kind of talked about the middle of the last week in the premillennial view, tribulation, great tribulation. In the middle of the week, in verse 27, he'll make a covenant with many, and then he'll cut off the grain and the sacrifices. Does that kind of remind you of anything? Does that instantly make you start thinking about something? It does me when I read it.
What do you think about
It's a
that?
picture of Jesus' death.
Yeah,
He was being tried during the week, and then he was crucified, and then he was resurrected.
If
And
you
that
look-
changed.
if you look at the prophetical view of the 1 week, I think what it's trying to say is he will make us a covenant with many. So his covenant will come in, the new covenant will come in, and then in the middle of the week, he will cut off the sacrifices and the grain offering. In the middle of the week, or after the sacrifice, after the death of Jesus, the Old Testament ceases to exist. It's a transition period. It seems to be pretty clear there to me. I mean, it seems to make a lot of sense. Any other thoughts on that? Tom, you were going to say something.
Well, you said, does anybody think about anything about what 27 says? And then you said, I know I'm thinking about something, so I wanted to pick your brain and see what you thought. Which I know is contradictory. You just asked us what we think, but I want to see what you
Tell me what I was
think.
thinking. Can I get the prophecy over here?
I bet I'm thinking what you're thinking. You tell me.
I know that you know that I know. Yeah, when I read that prophecy, that verse, that immediately makes me think of Christ, the Old Testament, or the Old Covenant, and the New Covenant. You know, the abolition of the sacrifice and stuff.
Yeah.
That's immediately what I think of.
Well, like when I read that verse, I kind of thought about it as like, you know, we always have these. This is kind of an analogy. We have like the tech companies out there, and they'll like, and then people will find out, okay, this is the next thing's coming out, and they'll leak the information. I think it's kind of like an info leak in the Bible that hey, we're gonna transition to the New Testament.
Oh yeah, that is absolutely
a sacrifice. Yeah, so that's kind of like my interpretation, my analogy of it. It's like a leak, or like sneak peek. Like
Funny-
what's coming up.
The funny thing is that I don't think the people in the Old Testament knew what the new leak was.
Right.
They were being told there's going to be a new leak, and they were being like, we get the Monday morning quarterback version, right?
Yeah.
Because we know what happened. When this was happening in Daniel, they had no idea what it meant. That he was going to, in the middle of the week, stop the sacrifice and grain offerings. They didn't know what that meant. They didn't have a clue.
Yeah, I mean, you know, even if there was supposed to be information relayed, it's not like now we have all this technology. Like it was a lot of time and labor to relay that big of a message to that big of a population or town or city, whatever. You know. Sorry, I was rambling.
So can I go back to
Yeah.
9:27, what Rachel was saying? It's interesting because I'm looking at some things, and in my commentary, or the study here says that he is the Antichrist.
That is the view of, I believe, the non-millennial. No, actually, it's the premillennial view, and it is the Antichrist as well. We're going to talk about it.
The Antichrist, you said?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're going to get in. There's a few more notes, so we can discuss it. Let me just read here from, 26. Who is the he referring to? The verse is it's either referring to the Messiah in verse 26 or the people of the prince in verse 26. So the word is he and not they. Must be talking about the Messiah in verse 26. He will make a firm covenant Jesus Christ brought with him. The new covenant that took effect when he died on the cross. We know Hebrews 9:15 through 18. With the new covenant in effect, the death of, with the new covenant in effect at Jesus' death, this was to put an end to the sacrifices and the offerings of the people of God. Now that there had been the sacrifice of Jesus, obviously we know there's no need for animal sacrifices. Hebrews 10 talks about this. Hebrews 7, 26 through 28. We know these verses from Bible study growing up. Thus, according to verse 27, he would put a stop to the sacrifices and offerings. And here's what you were asking. This gets to what you were asking about. So, or actually, I think it does. We'll talk about it though. Also in verse 6, the last point, in 26. Point 6, last verse 26. We also notice that the people of the prince would be the ones who come in and destroy Jerusalem and the temple. Who are these people? History tells us. Who are these people? If you go by the symbolic view, and history tells you, it's the Romans. The Romans are the ones that in 70 AD laid siege to Jerusalem, destroyed the city and the temple. This is exactly what Jesus prophesied in Luke 21, and a parallel passage in Matthew 24:15 gives us the same account. Those are just verses if you guys want to go back and look. It basically talks about this section that we're in. And in 24:15 he says, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place. Jesus reminds his readers that it is what Daniel had spoken of here in Matthew 9, verses 26, 27. This may get into it. We'll talk about it. Even if I don't have it in the notes, we'll talk about what you're talking about. The abomination of desolation, according to Jesus, in Luke 21, is the people who would destroy Jerusalem, the Romans. This is the meaning of the end of verse 27. Here we see the wings of abomination shall be the ones who makes desolate. The Romans made desolate the city of Jerusalem and the temple of God. The end of verse 27 tells us that that upon the Romans a complete destruction will be poured out. The interpretation seems to fit better than the other two views. Obviously, it's open to interpretation. It's open to opinion. Yeah, the Antichrist. I thought I had notes in here on that.
That's in my Bible too.
Actually, I did last week.
Yeah.
I think.
I can read it before James mentioned it.
Yeah, go ahead and talk about that if you want to. That's kind of a conflict. Then it depends on how you view the two main views.
So when I read it just without reading the commentary, what I got from it was that it's talking about Jesus. And then I read the commentary, and it's talking about that it's the Antichrist.
Yeah. When I'm looking at the context in Daniel 9, I have to think it's a more historical context, or a more historical prophecy. And that it deals with Romans, because we're talking about the destruction of the city, destruction of the temple. We're talking about the Messiah being cut off, which is a common phrase in Scripture of the crucifixion. That's all that is. If the phrasing is confusing to you, that's all that it is. So, could it be the Antichrist? I mean, I guess. To me, though, the context and everything would seem to indicate that verse 26 is talking about Jesus. Although that is the view of some people that it's actually the Antichrist. But if you hold that view, then it's an end of time view for this prophecy that you think. You have to hold that. If you think it's the Antichrist, then it has to be a Armageddon-like end of time view, it would seem, right? So it has to be one or the other. Is it a life or death thing? No. But did you have some? Go ahead. I know you want to comment.
No, because it's interesting because I've gone to like 5 different areas and 5 different teachings, and it all points
The Antichrist.
to the Antichrist, and just a capture of the Antichrist will make peace and will make a peace covenant with Israel for 1 week, 7 years, guaranteeing Israel's safety in the land. Israel will sign this contract with the head of the revived Roman Empire, the Antichrist. The 7 years will begin immediately, and then we go to what I think of the Left Behind series. After the rapture, the many refers to Israel in verse 24, and he breaks this covenant in the middle of the week, 3.5 years. Daniel calls this a time, in quote, a time, times, and half a time. 7:25, 12:7, and Revelation 12:14. And then John calls this 1,260 days and 42 months in Revelation 11:3, 12:6, 11:2, and 13:5.
You know, the whole Antichrist view, again, that is the view, I believe, of the first one that we did, the non-millennial view. But there's also a view when it talks about these in verse 26 and 27 that there's an opinion of scholars that it's actually talking about the Roman period and the Emperor Vespasian. I don't know. I mean, it's as simple as that. I don't know. It just depends on what view you espouse. Do you have to espouse a view on this? Yeah.
You know, and Chris he's very clear about, reading interpretations, right?
Yeah.
People's interpretations of this, here, and everywhere else. And so sometimes I find myself, like Rachel, I won't read this until I try to interpret what's going on with the words and when it speaks to me. So this can be very confusing to a new believer.
Oh yeah. The question I always ask myself, because I don't know the answer to this. I don't know if it's Antichrist.
I don't know.
I can read it as Antichrist, talk about the prince, the people of the prince, and is that the he? Maybe. I don't know. Could be. But at the end of the day, the Bible is intended to build your spiritual strength and knowledge. And I just try to always consider it from that standpoint. Like what is it that God is trying to tell us here? And I personally, and this is just me, but I personally don't get any edification of considering this as the Antichrist. Right? It doesn't do anything for me to go like, all right, pumps me up and I'm getting ready to go fight. It doesn't do that for me. But if I think about it from the standpoint that in Daniel, it was predicting the gospel, then I'm like, okay, this has been planned, which you didn't really talk about it. I'm surprised that it didn't talk about it in the symbolic view. The 70 years, I've seen it in many, many places where 70 is
70 weeks, you mean?
the 70 weeks is a symbolic view of the fact that 7 is perfection and 10 is a number of magnitude.
Yeah.
So, it's one of those things where we continue to try to strengthen it.
That's Lisa's family and stuff.
Okay.
You want to open the door for them? I thought they were going to park up front by the sign. Again, going back into Revelations, we're talking about like perfect numbers and 7s and 10s. Yeah, it's a lot of similar. Hey, how you doing? A lot of similar. A lot of similar wording and stuff. Like Chris says, I mean, what's this trying to tell you? Is it trying to tell you about the end of times? Is that what the angel Gabriel is prophesying to Daniel about? Or is it a prophecy about Daniel's descendants and the time of the Messiah?
And one final thing. What was the context of chapter 9? Why did Gabriel come down?
To offer the vision because Daniel was praying about current issues. They were almost at the end of their Babylonian captivity. Daniel knew this from the scripture. He was praying. Gabriel came down and says, okay, that's you've got some more to go through. Your people have some more. 70 weeks is what the vision says. Although that's an interpretive. It's not 70 weeks literally. It can't be. That's several months. A year and a half. Something.
So let me read verse 19.
Go ahead.
O Lord, hear. O Lord, forgive. O Lord, listen and take action for your own sake. O my God, do not delay, because your city and your people are called by your name. So if you think about what was the point that why was Daniel even asking for this? And then what did God give them as the message? You have to take that into consideration too when you interpret this stuff. Because Gabriel is trying to, if you look, and I know I'm getting ahead,
That's all right.
but it gets to the point where Daniel is comforted by some of these messages and some of the imagery, right? He starts to feel more confident in things. That's important, right? If you're thinking about what the interpretation of this is, you need to also take that into context to understand that this is intended to build up Daniel, even though it's not what he necessarily wants to hear at the moment. It is something that he wants to, that's going to motivate him to keep going. I don't think talking about the Antichrist is necessarily going to get you.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to fit to me, although that is a popular religious view.
It is.
Doesn't make it right. Again, and we've talked about this, and Daniel 9, it's dicey. It's very controversial. It's very difficult. And there are several views, and in fact, Tyler has 4 in his Bible, and that's fine. Is this a life or death salvation issue to me? So, we have to get through it. Chapter 10 is going to be easier. There is another prophecy or vision in chapter 10. It's a lot easier. It's stuff that we've already talked about, and what Chris is teaching on Wednesday nights. I'll put a picture up next week. The prophecy or the vision in chapter 10, and the one in Revelation, I forgot the chapter, where it talks about the Son of Man and the two visions that he sees, very similar. We've got, just a couple of minutes. We can go ahead and have an intermission if you guys want to, and get ready for service. Any other questions or comments? Okay.
I just have to go research.
You're done?
It's a lot of stuff.
You give up?